Ladies and gentlemen, go for our wild, wild ride with the Honey Badgers. But beware, the sweetest kittens have the sharpest claws. For your own safety, strap yourself in and hold onto something as we enter the Pussycat cast. Taboo topics.
Wait a second. Men are human too.
Marginalized men. Uncomfortable truths.
Suck!
The Pussycats aren't afraid of heavy lifting.
Welcome to the Pussycat cast number 11 or 11. This week's verbal Valkyries are our polecat punster turned part-time Pussycat pugilist Hannah, the rant-zerking rationalist of right rage Karen, the principled, passionate, plucky, and pleasant Prim Reaper, and the pickle in this clam bake, myself, the Supreme Doge in charge. Special thanks to the CIA ninjas. Thanks for tuning in. Now, today's show will not be a news topic show. We're going to be talking about a specific feminist talking point, also a very important one regarding domestic violence. We're going to be talking about the Duluth Model, as, well, you'll see that it's really relevant and extremely important. And Hannah has written something up about it, so I'm going to hand her the floor so we can get right into this topic right away. Hannah.
Okay, here we go. This is going to be a little long, so fasten your seatbelts. The Duluth dysfunctional design, as I like to call it. The Duluth model is the most commonly used partner abuse intervention program in the United States. According to the book, Education Groups for Men Who Batter, the Duluth Model, the program was mainly developed by the book's authors Ellen Pence and Michael Paymar, with contributions to its formation by a small group of battered women's activists who they asked to critique their work. The program's original version was based on interviews with women attending educational classes offered by the Duluth Battered Women's Shelter, filtered through a feminist perspective. The book's introduction describes how the details were hammered out by the group play acting in a class session, with these critics asking questions from a standpoint of victims and the program's authors providing answers. The program itself is based on the feminist theory that domestic violence is a male behavior involving keeping control in relationships through violence. Men are presumed invulnerable to domestic violence based on the, quote, status, end quote, aspects of feminism's patriarchy theory. This is the excuse used to gender the issue, with an eye toward only treating violence as aggression when men engage in it, and only treating it as self-defense when women engage in it. Pence and Paymar used a visual aid titled The Power and Control Wheel to illustrate their assertions, drive home the feminist theory behind them, and infer credibility upon the program. Adoption of this model by much of the family violence victims advocacy movement contributed to the United States Congress voting to modify the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act of 1984 with essentially its replacement, the Violence Against Women Act of 1994. VAWA allowed for family shelters, previously non-discriminatory by law, to begin excluding men from most victim services, including housing for victims seeking escape from abusive partners. Most locations instead respond to male victims with offers of perpetrator programs. At best, a battered man can hope to be housed in a hotel for a few days or directed to a homeless shelter, and there is no assistance for battered fathers with children in tow. There is compelling evidence against the beliefs on which the Duluth model is based, including the demographic assumptions. Angela Moore Parmalee, PhD, from the Department of Justice, wrote in Violence Against Women, Volume 10, Number 12, 2004, page 1424, "We have no evidence to date that the Violence Against Women Act has led to a decrease in the overall level of violence against women." What could be more damning to the assertions on which the law is based than the Justice Department seeing no decrease in criminal incidents resulting from its application? Research shows that contrary to the claim of the program's originators, most partner violence is bidirectional, meaning that both partners engage in it, and women initiate violence more often regardless of whether the violence is bidirectional or unidirectional. Women, in other words, are the majority of partners who assault first, and the majority of partners who assault a partner who does not hit back. This does not bode well for the Duluth Model's theory of patriarchal power and control. The program's critics even include one of its own authors. In the book, Coordinating Community Responses to Domestic Violence, Lessons from Duluth and Beyond, co-authored with Melanie Shepard, Ellen Pence admitted the model was ideology-driven, and its framers had ignored the phenomenon's reality in order to cling to that ideological view. Speaking for myself, she wrote, I found that many of the men I interviewed did not seem to articulate a desire for power over their partner. Although I relentlessly took every opportunity to point out to men in the groups that they were so motivated and merely in denial, the fact that few men ever articulated such a desire went unnoticed by me and many of my coworkers. Eventually, we realized that we were finding what we had already predetermined to find. Unfortunately, you can't put the hangover back in the bottle. The Duluth model continues to dominate the family violence victim services industry, and the beliefs behind it are codified into U.S. law, which is now being copied all over the Western world. Adherence to it has become the biggest obstacle to reducing the overall incidence of domestic violence in the U.S. and anywhere else the program has been adopted and the law changed to match. What has this led to? Support resources for victims, for abuse victims, are reserved for women to the exclusion of men due to insufficient social and legal consideration for abused men. There's insufficient consideration for abused men because men's experience of abuse is viewed as the rare exception to what is normally a women's issues. Men's experience is viewed as the rare exception to what is normally a women's issue because activists who work with abuse victims see very few men among them. Activists who work with abuse victims see very few men among them because abused men don't seek support resources. And abused men don't seek support resources because they know they're not available to them or intended for them. And there's even a stigma associated with men who admit to being abused and who seek those resources. Wash, rinse, repeat. So feminists, look at the point in that self-perpetuating cycle where abused men do not try to obtain access to resources that aren't for them and don't fit their situation and say, look here, this is the problem. Men don't seek help. They never take into consideration the fact that seeking help from a system that won't serve you doesn't get you anywhere, and that the more desperate your need, the bigger a waste of time it is to do that. MRAs look at the point in the cycle where the victim support system ignores abused men and point out that that is the problem. If men could get help, that cycle would break. Feminists respond by arguing the very things that keep the cycle going. That abused men are a rarity, as evidenced by the observations of volunteers at organizations which only help women, and therefore providing resources for abused men would be an unnecessary drain on resources needed for the so-called primary victims, women. Some even go so far as to suggest that male abuse victims should start their own shelters because patriarchy. So abused men get castigated for not seeking help, castigated for seeking help, accused of siphoning help away from women, blamed for not having access to help that is reserved for women, and marginalized by the people who treat the fact that places which only help women and treat men who contact them as perpetrators instead of victims don't see very many men seeking help from them. And what's the response to those of us who have the audacity to point out the insanely dysfunctional, self-perpetuating nature of this set of circumstances? Oh my God, you hate women! This problem isn't something which ideologues working in the victim services industry are going to be interested in fixing, because to do so, many of them, because to do so would require abandoning deeply held beliefs, and others because perpetuating the existing narrative is their meal ticket. Ultimately, to reduce family violence, our society must stop praising and paying ideologues for ignoring the actual dynamics and manifestation of the phenomenon, engendering our society's response to it. For the industry to walk back a wrong step of this magnitude, it must face public scrutiny, public criticism, and public pressure on legislators to revert the law back to the days before Duluth's influence and before feminism's influence on the support system.
If you're listening to this after the live show and you want to hear the full stream, go to www.honeybadgerradio.com for our unabridged podcasts, or look up to the right of this video. There's a link to go directly to the unabridged version on YouTube.
There are two ways in which feminist-run family violence shelters get around the Constitution in terms of non-discrimination. As long as they are providing some services for both sexes, and they can say they are providing some services for both sexes, it doesn't necessarily have to be the same services. They can claim, based on their belief system, based on the Duluth Model, that they are providing services that each sex needs, and that the sexes need different services based on the characteristics of their, basically their manifestation of their end of family violence. So if they portray the situation as if domestic violence is something that men do and women experience, then the perpetrator services that they push on abused men who come to shelters for help, they can claim that that's sufficient, that those services are the services those men need, that they're at risk for abusing their wives because their wives are pushing them. And it's not considered abuse when their wives are psychologically abusive to them, or when their wives don't injure them in the course of physically attacking them. So they don't have to do anything in terms of sheltering men. And then if they do shelter men at all, they do only stick them in a hotel for a few days, or they send them to a homeless shelter, and they can consider that a service for men. And so they get away with claiming to have an equal response when they really don't. And it becomes a much more difficult prospect to fight a legal battle against that. And considering the fact that actual victims of domestic violence, particularly victims who do not have a legal system protecting their property rights and their custody rights, that being men, they don't have the money for that kind of legal battle. They would actually have to have some sort of public assistance for that. They'd have to have funding from a group, or they'd have to crowdsource their case, and it is very difficult to get money from people to help men. So you probably won't see this tested in the Supreme Court. This is going to have to be a grassroots effort. It's going to have to be something where we don't rely on the Supreme Court to fix this law. We have to rely on the public pressuring the legislators to do the right thing. The push for this, like the social push for this, started with the second wave. And the legal push for it, the lobbying for it, kind of hit in the 70s.
We're talking about the second wave of feminism, for those of you guys listening that don't know.
The second wave of feminism. And this is like, let's see if I can call up this article quickly or not. But this was something like Susan Brown Miller was involved. The research we talk about that Mary Koss did was involved. Gloria Steinem and her publication were involved. So this was, but there was a point at which there was a hearing in Congress, and this wasn't specifically for the creation of domestic violence victims legislation, but when you talk to legislators, you're talking to the same legislators that are going to vote for any law that goes in front of that Congress. But in 1978, during hearings before the House of Representatives Subcommittee on Select Education, notice they're targeting everything, like select education, okay? 95th Congress second session on HR 7927 and 8948. And there's a link to a PDF in my article, Abused Boys and Men, Feminism's Acceptable Losses on a Voice for Men, that actually details this testimony. Feminists submitted feminist writing as evidence in order to persuade Congress to treat violence in general as a male perpetrated female suffered behavior attributable to masculine characteristics, the pressure of traditional gender roles in societal structure, patriarchy, basically. So they basically treated all violence experienced within the family and violence in general as a patriarchal tool of dominance and oppression. And one of the quotes I have in this was, society's treatment of women throughout history has never been one that we can be proud of, as Susan Brown Miller wrote in her book Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape. As the first permanent acquisition of man, his first piece of real property, woman was in fact the original building block, the cornerstone of the house of the father. Man's forcible extension of his boundaries to his mate and later to their offspring was the beginning of his concept of ownership. In fact, studies have shown that wife abuse has its roots in the very structure of society and the family, where the husband is expected to play the role of leader. If this position is threatened, many men fall back on their ultimate resource of physical force. The widespread existence of wife beating today underscores the fact that these societal exceptions are still prevalent. And it's page 67 in the file, in the document. It's page 60. Susan Brown Miller's book, her entire book, and then was submitted as evidence, and quotes for it from it were offered directly as evidence in addition to the book being cited. They selectively quoted even from Aaron Pizzey's work, but they didn't quote from the bits about men's experience of domestic violence, only the fact that women experience domestic violence. So they were very crafty in doing this. They went to Congress with this narrative, and they didn't have anybody contradicting it, and to the degree that, I mean, there wasn't really anybody that knew what was going on, what they were doing. You know, we didn't have, Congress wasn't televised. We didn't have every aspect of what Congress was doing all the time available to us. So people could do things like this, and you wouldn't find out until it hit the news that laws were being considered based on it. And when the newspapers published stories about this, a lot of them just published the feminist narrative along with it. So basically, society had a nice little scam run on them, and we're figuring it out and understanding it now. And now we're in a position of having to walk it back instead of being able to prevent it in the first place.
Well, one of the most interesting things about that too is that Susan Brown Miller has since walked back a lot of her assertions from Against Our Will, and Aaron Pizzey and her are friendly now, right? But Aaron Pizzey said, you know, nowadays Susan Brown Miller will write an article. It will be a decent article these days. But what is in her bio? It's always Against Our Will. That was the best-selling one, right? She's essentially just this marginalized feminist now. And her one claim to fame was this book that she has since backpedaled on, right? And nobody wants to actually come out and say that, yeah, no, she's actually disavowed a lot of the claims she made in that book.
Is it also being utilized, you think, in other countries? Like, does Canada, the UK?
It's the most used all over the world.
Yeah.
Okay.
Worldwide, globally.
And the United Nations uses it and is promoting it in third world countries. Remember when I said that because of the Violence Against Women Act, judges and court personnel are trained in the Duluth Model? That means that if we bring a hearing, a discrimination hearing with respect to this law, and we try to take this to the Supreme Court, and you don't start with the Supreme Court. You can start with federal courts as opposed to local courts if you're fighting something federal, but you can't start with the Supreme Court. You have to get there from another court. I may be wrong on that, but from what I remember learning about the Supreme Court, that's the fact. So you actually have to go through these steps. We would be facing, if we decided to just do this now without building any groundwork and raising awareness and getting public support for it and, dealing with legislators and so on, we would be facing a judge who is predetermined to see everything we say as wrong, dishonest, an attack on women, and so on, because they are trained to believe the narrative on which the Duluth model is based. So it would be not just a complicated battle and not just an expensive battle, but also an uphill battle. It would be like appealing to the Pope for a change in church doctrine, that the church had been teaching the polar opposite of that doctrine, and that anybody who believed the church had been teaching the polar opposite of what you're trying to articulate, and that anybody that believed what you are trying to articulate is uttering blasphemy and damning themselves and anybody who listens to them to hell. That's how entrenched this is. That's why I keep saying the court system is not the way to go for this. And it was never meant for the court system to be the primary resource of the people for changing bad laws. It was meant to be a last resort when Congress gets out of control and starts passing bullshit, or when something unpredictable happens with a law, but you can't get Congress to overturn or fix it. And this is a situation where, because they're training court personnel, that there's no fail-safe there. There's no checks or balances, and we're going to have to go through the same process to undo this that was taken to do it. Minus the lying and victim signaling.
I have a better model. How about we initially, when somebody makes a complaint, take a public health approach? Because most of the cases of domestic violence are reciprocal, and they're minor, right? So it's a push, a shove, somebody grabbed somebody's arm, right? It was a slap, whatever, right? And it was brought on by external stressors, drug addiction, mental illness, poor conflict resolution skills, all kinds of things that don't have anything to do with patriarchy and don't necessarily even have anything to do with ongoing abuse, right? This is a shitty situation. We just found out our daughter's on fucking crack and she's pregnant, right? And it's your fault. No, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. And then people start shoving and stuff, right? Okay. That's a lot of cases. So let's take a public health approach to those. Let's not take a criminalization approach. Let's look at counseling. Let's look at anger management. Let's look at, conflict resolution courses for both parties. Let's look at those things, right? And only when there's a pattern of abuse, right, should we have major interventions where you remove somebody from the home. I mean, so many women now, right, don't phone the police when their partners are getting violent because they don't want their partner to be removed from the home. And they know that is the inevitable conclusion, even in minor incidents, right? The Duluth model, one of the things that it does is it stipulates that couples counseling is not just counterproductive, it's dangerous, right? And so services that are funded under VAWA, if they offer couples counseling, they lose, or recommend couples counseling, they lose their funding, right? The entire purpose of the Duluth model is to break up the family.
Erin Pitsey actually had a model for dealing with domestic violence that worked. She was actually seeing results until feminists took her work away from her, not only kicked her out of her work, but out of her homeland. They actually harassed her to the degree that she could no longer live in the country where she grew up. I mean, that's how violent feminists are. So in addition to anything else that would have to be done, and I would say go back to Aaron Pittsey's system, you'd have to take the feminist ideology out of domestic violence victim services. That would mean getting rid of a lot of people involved, because a lot of those people wouldn't abandon their belief system. The cycle starts young with men and boys, and it gets worse every step of the way. And I mean, it's to the point today where in the United States, our penal system is using punishments on children, not young adults, not just adolescents, but actual, like, under 13 years old children that are clinically proven to damage their mental health in ways that increase the chances that they're going to engage in further criminal acts and eventually become criminally violent. This is actually the way kids are treated in the United States in a lot of areas. If, say, they run away from an abusive home, or they're hungry and they shoplift food, or they don't have sufficient training at home on how to behave, and they act out in public or in school. And in some cases, simply because their school system isn't equipped to handle their particular disability. So, I mean, this goes very deep, and it's one of those, it's one of those things, if you stare into it too much all at once, it will guaranteed make you sick, like physically ill. Anytime, anyone, if you're listening, anytime you find a source for factual, documented information, good research with good methodology, historical information and things like that, anytime you find that, archive it. Use archive.org, use archive.is, use freeze page, use any number of various, and don't just archive it in one place either, because there were things archived on archive.org of the National Organization for Women's Agitation Against Fathers' Rights groups that were scrubbed from archive.org because National Organization for Women requested it. It says when you try to seek out those pages that they were removed by request. And the only person that can request a website's removal is the owner of that website or the owner of that information.
The situation for men, hundreds of men killed, dozens of men tried for treason and insurrection, facing the noose, right? Exiled to penal colonies, frickin' dying in prison. That's what men went through to get their right to vote. To bring the right to vote from 3% of people in Britain to 35% of men in Britain. That's the price that they had to fucking pay.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And how many fucking suffragettes in the UK died getting women's right to vote? I can answer that. It was one. Emily Davison. Emily fucking Davison. She decided, in cahoots with her radical militant feminist group, that she was going to jump onto the fucking racetrack during a horse race and pin a suffragette banner on the king's horse as it barreled past her at 40 miles an hour, and she got trampled under his hooves. And thank God nobody else was killed in her publicity stunt gone wrong. And oh my goodness, the horror and the misery. And the feminists who are complaining about how the suffragists were force-fed in prison, yeah, that's what everybody did when they went on a hunger strike. And why were these feminists going on a hunger strike? Because they wanted to be declared political prisoners, so they could go get political asylum in other countries and not go to prison for what they did. And the reason why they weren't granted that was because they weren't charged with treason or insurrection or a political crime that could actually get them fucking hanged, right? They were charged with arson and vandalism and assault and disturbing the peace. Even when they fucking attempted to assassinate the prime minister by throwing a hatchet at him, they weren't charged with fucking treason. They weren't charged with a capital offense.
Mm-hmm. You have to recognize
the inhumanity of them getting these charges and therefore not qualifying for political prisoner status and being force-fed like every fucking male prisoner who ever went on a hunger strike. Oh my God.
And you have to recognize these same ideologues, right? These same women who who committed all these crimes, who attempted a treasonous act and were not.
Acid in the mail. They sent acid in the mail. They laced letter with acid. They firebombed train stations. They set fire to museums and churches.
Yep,
with
and
people
churches.
in them.
These
they
same
set fire
women
to a fucking theater to try to kill the prime minister. A theater full of fucking innocent people. They set fire to it.
These same women who were making this demand were the primary participants of the white feather movement. The white feather movement was women who were used by their government during World Wars I and II to shame men into going to war, into volunteering for the front lines. And they didn't just, they didn't just shame able-bodied men of military age. They shamed boys who were too young to be in the military, who they shamed into lying about their age, because it was a hell of a thing to have a white feather pinned to you. You were being publicly called out as a treasonous level coward, someone who cared so little about your own country and the women in your country and the safety of your country that you wouldn't even defend any of it. And they got teenagers, underage teenagers, sent to war. They sent disabled veterans back to the front lines. They sent men who were too old to be in the military back to lie about their age to try to get back into the military so that they could go and die on the front lines for these women's satisfaction. And that was men and boys who couldn't vote. They didn't have the legal right to vote because most of them were too poor to qualify. And these women who were demanding that they be given the voting franchise sent those men to die for their voting rights. And the same thing happened in the United States.
A lot of the negativity that I've suffered in my life has been at the hands of other women, like my stepmother, or like other. Often, a lot of the time, it's mother figures. Maybe this is why I'm like, yeah, men aren't always the enemy, because women are plenty capable of being evil people. So, I don't know. Maybe that's just my upbringing, but it hasn't been the case for me. That's for darn sure.
It is easy for feminists and there are other ideologues that do this too. It's not just feminists, but it is easier to get people to give up civil rights or human rights, to give up legal protections for them, and to allow legal infringement on them.
To protect women.
Yeah, if you argue to protect women. And so that narrative, that starkly gendered picture of history, in which it's treated as though men, either by accident, which I think is a hilarious claim, or by being essentially sociopaths, kept women down all this time, dominated and controlled and enslaved women all that time, and women are just getting out from under their thumbs. That narrative is necessary for authoritarian social micromanagement. It's necessary for authoritarian movements that want to put a wedge in between people and their civil rights. It's necessary if you want to get people to say, no, I don't need the right to defend myself in court. I don't need it when if I have it, that means that some woman somewhere isn't going to be able to have recourse against somebody that did something bad to her. It's easier to get people to accept that if you put it in terms of It's your rights versus some woman's welfare. If you looked at the division between restrictions that women faced and the laws that men faced, you would be able to line them up. The restrictions that women faced were based on men's obligations and facilitating those obligations. You cannot have person A responsible for person B's welfare if you do not give person A some control over what risks person B is allowed to take. And it was that way with regard to property. It was that way with regard to freedom of movement. It was that way with regard to legal representation. It was that way with regard to if the restrictions that men faced, where they were, or the obligations that men faced, where they could be held legally responsible if their wives broke the law. If a woman had an income that a man couldn't touch, but she didn't pay her taxes, he could go to jail. American suffragettes withheld their taxes. They didn't pay their taxes and sent their husbands to jail as a form of protest because their husbands didn't support their movement. So this was a situation where feminists treat something as a form of oppression when it was a situation that was part of the way society developed, part of the way civilization evolved. And when feminists fought to alleviate women of their restrictions and their obligations under those laws,
They kept everything in place for men.
They worked tooth and nail to retain the obligations and restrictions on men on which women's obligations restrictions were based. So now men face those obligations and those restrictions without the complementary laws that were in place to facilitate their ability to meet those obligations and live by those restrictions. That is why today you see men getting hit with child support obligations that are beyond their income and then jailed for not making enough money to maintain their ex-wives' standard of living.
We should really wrap this up because we got to do the after show. So we'll continue the discussion in the after show. Maybe look at an article. I have something in mind. It's about how Ben & Jerry's, and there's a Ben & Jerry's, I believe, in Australia, which is oddly topical, which is they're not allowing 2 scoops of the same flavor. I think you might be able to guess why that might be. So we'll go ahead and go in there to get a laugh out of it. And before I go, I want to mention that the fundraiser to get me to Australia is still ongoing. Go to the feedthebadger.com if you want to see me down under in Sydney and in the Gold Coast. Also, don't forget to RSVP your spot at the Sydney meetup by sending an email to tickets@feedthebadger.com. That's tickets@feedthebadger.com. If I am successfully funded, I will be going skydiving to raise awareness for men's suicide, ironically, with Mike Buchanan of UK's Fathers for Justice. I'm totally stoked that I'm going to do something that could end my grisly demise, and I'm not totally like Allison, who sensibly said no, because she's not an idiot. Go to feedthebadger.com and get me to Australia, where I will probably, highly likely, see my death. But it'll be for a good cause. So, and I guess that's it. So we're going to go ahead and get us out of here. I want to thank the other panelists on the Pussycat cast, specifically Karen, Prim Reaper, and Hannah. And thank you, Hannah, for doing that very well thought through write-up for the Duluth model, so that the people who are watching us that may not know about it will have an understanding as to why feminist domestic violence shelters are working under, most of the time, a very faulty model. That is the Duluth model. And this is why we exist, because the beginning of treatment is already starting from a place that could create harm.